Hello, everyone. I'm Alan Furstenberg.
And I'm Mark Tucker, and we are Two Voice Devs.
So this week's going to be a little bit different than before. This was actually a recording that Mark and I did of one of our working sessions. And I thought it was a really good conversation. What did you think, Mark?
We definitely went in there. There was a series I had done on Twitter about language model and what does it mean and how do I, manipulate the language model to get the different responses that I need or make sure that I get the right input.
Right. And I saw that and I'm like, I feel like I don't have enough knowledge here to really answer Mark from my point of view. So we kind of agreed that we just wanted to chat about it before we actually made an episode about it.
But that turned out to be a great conversation as we explored different things and learned definitely something new about how Google does it versus how Alexa does things. And we just really hope you enjoy this session and that you have a great week just doing voice dev.
So here we are, our past selves, talking about slots and intents.
And entities and
all that
types,
fun stuff, yeah.
And all kinds of fun stuff.
It was...
And what was the topic?
Oh, no, I remember what you talked about something, and I think I said something like, I'm not even sure I understand the fundamental slot filling, slots, types.
Oh, how we talk about it. What your paradigm is and my paradigm is
right.
when it comes to slots and intents and entities and stuff.
Right. That was it.
Yeah.
Because I feel
we got
like,
there.
Right. Yeah, because one of the feelings that I always have when I am working with Alexa and talking and listening to you guys talk about it is I feel like our mental model, especially when it comes to slot filling, is just slightly different.
Well, let's start with intent and make sure that we're understanding the same terminology. So An intent is something that invokes a handler. You can have multiple sample utterances that would trigger that, or I guess map to that intent, which would trigger the handler. That's the same?
It is not incorrect. Let's put it that way.
All right, so how would you phrase it?
It is, I refer to an intent purely as what the user says or does. Now, in some cases that reflects it usually reflects what they say, but in Dialogflow, it can also represent a more generic event. So just starting the action triggers an intent. User,
right?
And the user might have said something, but we don't find out what that is.
Okay, that's interesting.
And
yeah, because obviously they say or do, Google tell me about or Alexa open.
Right.
Invocation phrase, right?
Right.
But that's what they
but we don't
say,
actually,
or I guess do could be an action link or a quick link, right now?
Yes. And it could also be an implicit invocation, like I want to know more about horses, or what does it take to be an engineer? That can, in theory, trigger an action.
Okay.
Now,
and in most of those cases, that would just be a launch, right? There's not a deep link implicit invocation.
Deep links actually do go directly to a specific intent.
Okay.
The other element to all of that, the other thing that's an event is under Dialogflow, certain responses are handled through events, not through the normal phrase parsing, not through the normal NLP stuff. So, for example, if we have presented a menu or a list of options, if the user selects one of those options, either by voice or by touching it on the phone, it triggers an event.
Yeah, so that's very similar. So if we're using APL and there is something that you tap on the screen, then that does invoke an event. which then turns into some actionable thing. It may not be exactly the same thing as
Right.
an intent, but yeah.
Yeah, but there's the catch. In Dialogflow, it is an intent.
Hmm.
And in Actions Builder, everything is an intent.
Yeah, I think I'll have to look that up since it's been a while since I've done events. Well, and in APL versus the older style display templates. But yeah, there was like a selected item intent or something that would like a predefined built-in intent that got executed. Is that similar to what happens?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Okay.
So in general, I think our definitions of intents are more or less the same.
Okay. Now, does Google have very many built-in intents, or are they?
Not really.
Okay.
On the Dialogflow side, actually, there are no predefined intents at all. Or there are two intents that it gives you, and you can get rid of them if you want to, because you can define everything using events. There are a bunch of different events. On the action side, there are currently about 6 or 8 or so built-in intents. And I could go look it up, but
so yeah, it seems like Alexa has a lot more built-in intents than Google does, and all right, so that is interesting.
It's an
that approach, and in some cases you can extend a built-in intent with additional slot values, and in some cases, sample utterances, but in other cases you can't.
Now that's very interesting, because actually almost all of the built-in intents that Google has are not utterance intents. They are event intents. So there are things like media starts playing, media stopped playing, cancel, no match, no input.
Oh, that's interesting.
They're mostly things that represent more conceptual.
Oh yeah, so there's definitely a lot more built-in intents that are extensible on the Alexa side. So besides the stop and the cancel, there's like help and there's all kinds of ones that have values already.
I guess I had seen some of those, and I never registered that that's what those were built-in intents that you could extend. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. And that makes sense in a lot of ways, actually.
Now, how is the distribution, I guess, to other countries? Is everything available? I know that there's certain built-in intents that aren't available in other countries.
Almost everything is available on every language. The things that aren't available would be things like the transaction flow, and that's only because of governance limitations around transactions.
They also started this idea that there was going to be this whole series of intents, like they've got like books or music or things, and then there were like almost like subcategories inside of that.
And actually, now that you mention it, that's interesting, because Google does have this notion of a whole bunch of different basically they're launch intents. So things like, play a game is a special launch intent, and it's got a bunch of predefined phrases that are associated with it.
And that's as opposed to what is the standard launch?
The standard launch is ask so-and-so or open so-and-so.
Okay. And that's different than the play, right? Can you have both?
There's a good one, actually. And that's actually a big beef with a lot of people. Play is not a standard open command, unlike in Alexa.
Yeah.
Play is reserved for the music streaming actions, which are partners only.
I thought I saw that you could use play in connection with a game. No?
You can generically say, hey Google, I want to play a game. Cancel. But So as you just heard, you could say play a game or, play a word game or something
Yeah.
like that, and we'll pick one.
On the Alexa side, there's these built-in intent entity types, they call them. I haven't used them very much. And a lot of them still seem to be like in developer preview for like years now. So.
Yeah, well, on the Google side, we've got a bunch of similar ones where they're only starting to roll out for app actions now, and the play a game one, originally they had announced like 10 or 15 of them, and all of them are still in developer preview except for play a game. But they're all just launch intent.
Okay. All right. So anything else we wanted to explore on intents? I think
we've beaten intents to death. Yeah.
Okay. So now slots are what Google calls entities.
No. Well, okay. Keep going. Explain what you mean by that.
Okay. So a slot has a specific type that is associated with the slot. And you could have an intent that has, 0 slots, 1 slot, multiple slots. And each slot would have a specific type. It could be either a built-in intent type, or it could be something that you generate the list of types, list of values for. And those lists of values could have synonyms.
Okay.
And in Alexa, it could have IDs. Okay, go ahead.
So let me pause there and say that we actually do call those slots.
Okay.
Well, sort of. Some places we call them, some places we call them slots. Some places we call them parameters. Some places we call them parameters, but talk about slot filling.
Okay.
And so sometimes we treat slots and parameters as the same thing, and sometimes there are subtle differences between the two, and sometimes I don't know what the differences are, but there are differences. The types are what we call entity types, and entity types have entities in them. So for example, I could create an entity type called color, and it would have entities of red, green, blue. And I could create a slot named my color, and it would be of entity type color.
I see. Here, I'm going to log in.
And I hope I didn't just totally misrepresent what we actually call them, and with my own mental map of them.
Yeah, no, it does get interesting because you kind of get to a point where it's just kind of knowledge that you have, and it's been a while since you've actually looked at the docs for it. I'm bringing up a sample skill here, and I'm trying to see. So the interaction model is made up of intents, and just looking to see how they define the UI. And you've got a list of built-in intents and your standard intents. You've got slot types, and slot types have slot values.
Okay.
So that's how we define them.
So I think slot types, the equivalent are entity types.
Okay.
And entity
slot
types.
Values.
Yeah, and entity types, Dialogflow calls them entity entries.
Okay.
And similarly, we can, you have a primary, you have a primary value and then a bunch of aliases.
Right. Can you have an ID?
No, there is no specific ID, but what you commonly do is that the canonical value you make, it doesn't have to be something that is necessarily legible.
Okay. So the canonical value is the main value, and then you would just have all the actual, and that would be like the ID, and then all these synonyms would be the different representations of that. Okay.
Right. And one of the nice things under Google's model is that whenever slots or parameters get resolved, you are told not just what it resolved to, but also exactly what value the user used to fill that slot.
Okay, yeah. So we get the same thing. Do you get?
Okay.
Um, do you get if it was something that was in bounds or out of bounds, or like in the list of things that you defined versus it matched it to it, but it wasn't explicitly in the list?
A fuzzy match?
Well, it's not really a fuzzy match. It gives you the same
Okay.
piece of information, just like it was, you know, like if you had colors and you said yellow and yellow was in the list, it would also tell you that the place that it got it from was the list of things that you had in the list, as opposed to if you say gold and gold wasn't in the list, but it still matched to that, then you would know that it came
Yeah,
from the other place. It still matched, but it wasn't.
it calls that, Google tends to call that fuzzy matching.
Okay.
And you can enable that or disable that for an entity, but I don't believe it actually tells you whether it used fuzzy matching or not.
Okay.
That's
So
a good question.
you can restrict the list of entity, I guess, entity values or entities to a specific list. And if you say something
Yes.
that's not in the list, it ignores it.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Because everything is open-ended on the Alexa side of things.
Oh, interesting. No,
Yeah.
everything can be open-ended on the Google side, but by default you turn on fuzzy matching.
So
Or it turns on fuzzy matching.
that's kind of where it gets to so the things that you have when you're defining a slot value. This is I just love this. I think we should just do the two voice devs intro at the end of this and make it a session and keep the cat walking back and forth in front. So so when we're defining things that are going to be slots, the only things that you have control over is the list of samples that you give and the number of words that are in those samples to help train what are the types of things that this matches to.
Sorry, I went fuzzy there. Repeat what you just said again.
So when you're defining a list of slot types, or I guess it would be entities, or slot values and versus entities, then the only things that you have control over is the list of values that you provide, as well as, I guess, the number of samples that you provide and the number of words that are in the samples.
Yes. So when you're creating that type of entity, you're providing essentially a list of possible values.
Yes.
And synonyms for them.
Correct.
And you can, if you wish, narrow it to just those values.
So yeah, so like I say, on the Alexa side, it's always open-ended, but it seems like the more samples that you provide, the more that you're training it that this is, I don't know, it seems like in some cases, I guess, depending on what those samples are, you could be closing it in on the list of things that it picks, or it could be opening it up for additional things that you didn't list based on the word choices. And then, you know, and if you wanted to always have something that was just one word and all your samples were one word, I think it would limit the matching to one word, where if you had things that were 1, 2, and 3 words in there, then I think that the training would be, oh, this can handle values that or answers that are 1, 2, or 3 words, and then, you know, try to match it based on other things.
I think some of this also goes back to Dialogflow and Action Builder both can have the concept of a completely open-ended entity. And Dialogflow provides this as a built-in one called any. And on the Action Builder side, it's easy to create. So easy that you don't understand why they didn't do it. And I know that's, well, the last time I looked into this on the Alexa side, I know that you couldn't quite do that. You had the what did they go? The search field?
So there's the search query, but before the search query, there was the literal.
That's right, yes.
There was a type called the literal type, and then people were overly abusing it to try to get to the full sentence of what somebody said, like Google lets you get to. And I think there was a number of issues with it. And so they tried to deprecate it once, and then there was a whole bunch of uproar, and so they decided to, they backtracked on it, and then now over time they've gotten rid of it, and they started limiting it to only in the U.S., and then now it's
Yeah,
gone. But
that's okay. Yes, I remember that now, or I remember some of that now.
so what you have now is there is a slot type that is a search query, and I don't know what they've trained it on, but I'm assuming if you're saying, searching for something, and then, but it's interesting in the fact that you could be searching for all kinds of things. So I don't know exactly how you would train a very general search, because if you're on IMDb, you're searching for movies, actors,
right? But in that case, don't they have built-in entities for those other types?
They do. They've got ones for first names, and they've got ones for full names, character names, fictional character, fiction names.
What's interesting is Dialogflow has some of those. It used to have first names and family names, and Google, an Actions Builder doesn't have those. And part of the reason why is that I think we were seeing a lot of people saying, I use the first name type, but it was, wasn't finding all of the names of everyone in my company. How do I deal with that? And it's like, well, you extend it to put in all the names of everyone in your company, and while you're doing that, why are you using first name type? So I don't think they were seeing a very, very, very effective use out of it.
Yeah. So, sorry, what were we just talking about before that?
I think we just finished clarifying what slot types and entity types are. Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, so search query, whatever it's keyed off of, you can't. So there's the concept of that you can have. I can't remember. They call it all kinds of different things. I call it like an anchor word or an anchor phrase before or after. I think it's a carrier phrase, I think, is the official terminology on the Alexa side. So you can have various, even if it's a user-defined slot type or a built-in slot type, you can have that be part of an utterance that's part of an intent. And you can have it, at the beginning of the phrase, in the middle, at the end, or you can have it as no phrase at all. It's just the slot value itself. So that would be a situation where, like, who do you want to call? And then you can say, instead of having to say, I want to call Ghostbusters, then you can say Ghostbusters, right? So that works for built-in and I guess most built-in and custom slot types. But with search query, you have to have a carrier phrase. You can't not. And I think it's because it's so wide open that if you didn't have a carrier phrase, then it would just eat up everything else.
Well, it's so they didn't. I mean, I think some of it is at least because they don't want you to just start assigning everything. Literal. Yeah, they don't want to go back down the literal road.
Yeah, that's totally possible. That's what they're wanting to do. But yeah, then it makes for some situations like I'm working on something and I want a list of nicknames, and it could be various things that aren't real names, but they could be nicknames. But I want it to be open, and so I think originally I've coded it as a search query, but I think there's going to come a time when I'm going to ask a question and somebody wants to answer with just the nickname and nothing else, and then the search query is not going to work. It's not going to find an intent. So I'm going to have to do something with that. But
so let me ask you, so I guess kind of following on from that, are there session entity types? Actually, I know there are, and you don't call them that. You actually do it a little bit more cleverly, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, no, you tell me what those are, and maybe we'll figure out what they are.
So you can. So basically, in both Dialogflow and Action Builder, one of the things that you can do as part of fulfillment is say, add these values to this entity type for this user for this session.
Okay, dynamic entities.
Dynamic, okay.
All right, so yeah, let's explore dynamic entities a little bit. So I think the answer, the typical answer for Amazon is that they want you to predefine all of your slot types and values. And they're trying to make it really easy that if the only thing that you're changing is something that's in that language model, that it's going to be a quick, because anytime to a language model is a certification, a recertification process to do that. And they're trying to provide tools and other things to help you identify when there isn't matching to the language model, and things that you can do to fine tune and tweak that and have that turned around as quickly as possible.
Interesting.
So that's I think that's the approach, because when it comes to dynamic entity, it is very limited. It works well in a situation where, like, I don't know if question of the day or some other quiz game does this, but you get to the point where you're right before a question, because what happens is you have to return a directive back from a response, which means that you have to have at least one response that comes back. So like if you're saying, and the question is blah, 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 at the time that you're returning that response that's asking the question, you could return back a directive that includes a list of custom entities. So like, let's say it's, A, B, and C, A, B, C, D is always something that's accepted. But maybe you want to update it so that A maps also to, George Washington, if the question is about presidents or something like that. And so then the list of answers that you can answer, you can either answer by letter or by name, or by part of the name. So that's dynamic entities works really great in that situation, or you're like, show me the lunch menu, and you could get the list of items that are on the lunch menu and make sure that your entities exist for that. What it doesn't work for is like if you got a list of contacts and you want something, I know, well, I'll tell you the limitation, and then maybe, because you think that would be a perfect case, right? So if I'm doing something and I have access to a contact list of people's names that are, like my contact list, and let's say there's 100 people in it, you would think that I would be able to then get that information and download it and make dynamic entities out of it, so that it's a really crisp match on something that's important to me in my context. But the limitation is that you can only have 100 dynamic entities. Well, it's not really true that you can only have 100 dynamic entities. You can only have 100 values as part of dynamic entities. So like if I have one entity value and a synonym, that counts as 2. If I have 2 synonyms for that value, now I have three of my 100 quota filled, and that's all I get. And fairly quickly, you start running out of entities to handle something like that.
That's not too bad, because I mean, most of the cases where I see it, 100 is enough.
I've run into it in different situations with like pre-scanning somebody's inbox for people that are appointments that are coming up, and if you wanted to say, tell me about what appointments do I have with John Smith, then it would have to, there's just a whole bunch of different things that pretty soon, even with just a week ahead, with depending on the number of calendar invites and who's invited, then you run out of spaces quickly.
It's interesting. I quickly had to go look it up. Dialogflow doesn't give a limit on the number of session entities or aliases, which doesn't mean that there isn't one, but it means they don't list one. So three thoughts scattered around here. So that was one. 2 was Action Builder actually takes the notion of session entities and kind of takes it a step further, in that if you're building what they refer to as a list or a collection, which is a visual display of stuff, those have to be tied to a session entity, and it has to be a session entity.
Oh, that's interesting.
And in fact, all that you're doing in your list is saying, this list consists of these items from the session entity and references them by their primary entity name. And the session entity that you send back has a way that you can visually describe that entity. So they've attached the visual to the entity, not to this visual component, which is
that is interesting.
Odd in some ways, but it's in other ways it's brilliant because it's because now they're basically saying, before under Dialogflow, everything was kind of special cased. So when you sent that visual list, there was a special case somewhere that said, okay, here's the audio that will also trigger this visual list, and here are the audio aliases that will trigger that item on the visual list. And the result that you get back will never be an intent, or it will never be an utterance-like intent. It will never be a phrase-like intent. It will always be an event-based intent, just like you had pressed the button. So it was kind of saying, speaking is just like pressing a button in a voice-first world. And Action Builder flipped that around. It now said pressing the button is just like speaking.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
So everything is from a spoken word perspective, and all spoken words are handled the same.
A voice first perspective.
Yeah, what a concept. So that was two. What was it? The third one was, and one of the things that I thought I saw in the announcement about dynamic, I already forgot the name, dynamic types, what did you call them?
Dynamic entities.
Dynamic entities, thank you. Was that you would be able to set it on launch. So the initial, a deep link slot filling could use these entities.
I haven't seen that. There might have been a change. I know when I first used it that you had to have at least one response back to do that. There might be situations that you can set up now that does that, because like we had a situation like let's say that our skill did multiple things, and one of those was, you know, tell me about so and so, and that's from your contacts. If you were to launch in and the you know, and you get your welcome message and, like, you know, what would you like to do kind of thing, then I guess depending on the situation, it may not be, there might not have been enough of time for this thing to come back, this response to come back, to then give you the option of just saying, tell me about John Smith. It's kind of like you might have to fabricate are you ready to get started, or something like that, to do the response.
We'll deal with some of these. That's another issue. No, I had this issue when I was dealing with Voodoo Drive, is that, you know, I want to be able to say, you know, hey, G, open, ask Voodoo Drive to open the file name blood pressure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and if you're already in Voodoo Drive, I've loaded that file name as a session entity already. Okay. But until you get into it, I don't have that information. So it becomes a chicken and egg problem.
Right.
And I thought Alexa handled that by having a kind of pre-flight event.
You know, I have missed that. If that is the case, that's something I'm going to have to go back and look at, because it did seem like that was another limitation of dynamic entities. An additional limitation would be like if you have a situation where you've got multiple slots that are part of an intent, and both of those slots are dynamic entities. They both count against that 100.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah.
I can see how the 100 does end up being a limitation.
Yeah. Pretty
quickly. So I guess I can see that now. Yeah.
So maybe it still is on the Google side. You just don't know what the number is.
I'm sure there is a limit. I just, you know, document it. Wait. Anyway.
Well, and some of it comes back that it comes back as part of the payload coming back
Yeah,
as on the response JSON, and there is a limit on the number of like the
on the size of
size
that JSON.
of
Yeah.
that JSON coming back. And I can't remember. There was something I posted before. I don't know if it was like 56,000 or something like that. I can't remember the exact number, but
Yeah, I can't remember the number on my side
there is,
either.
yeah. So some limitation on that, and that's also includes our session variables that are being round tripped.
So I guess I'm not sure why I thought slots were so different between the two, because they
Yeah,
really do seem very, very similar.
yeah, and so what ends up happening on the Jovo side is that there is a language, like a Jovo language model, that is a common kind of a common approach to doing the language model across. Because right now they use Dialogflow 2 for the Google implementation of things. So what it does is seems like it took a lot of what the language model looked like on Alexa and then add some extensions. So you can either just define what these custom slot types are, and if you don't specify that it's different for Google versus Alexa, it just uses that value and then creates entities on the Google side and slot values on the Alexa side. But you can go into like different slot types and say, oh, if it's Alexa, then it's going to be an Amazon.person
Okay.
slot type, as opposed to if it's a Google, it's an @sys.person entity type. And you can define what the different built-in slot types are.
So I mean that now becomes a question on Jovo, which is something I hadn't explored. It sounds like Jovo helps you create the model.
Yes. So you
Ah,
define it in one .model file, and then there's a Jovo CLI. So there's a Jovo build command, and part of the Jovo build is you either specify a specific platform or you leave it open and it does all
oh,
platforms that you've got defined. And there's a platforms folder that then breaks out Alexa and Google, and that breaks out those specific files. So then on the Google side, then you can just zip that up and overwrite your entities on Dialogflow, and you've got
yeah,
your language
it makes
model.
perfect sense.
Yeah.
I hadn't. Let me put it this way: it's one of those things that I had kind of been mulling over. Yeah, this would be a nice, cool thing to do in the future, and I hope someone does it. So, and I
Yeah.
hadn't realized Jovo had gotten there yet.
Yeah, so Jovo's done that for years, and they just recently open sourced that
I saw the
language
open,
model.
yeah.
So then you with that, I guess, universal um, JSON format, and then there's the code that would be in essence what the build would be for that model, and you could specify that it's going to output as not only just Google and Alexa, but Jovo does a lot of other different things now that you can have different chatbots or different things. And so I don't know how extensive that is, but my understanding is it still would start from that same universal JSON language model format. And then you could output it to the different
That makes sense. That's what I would expect.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess the model was a lot more similar than I expected it to be.
Yeah, there's definitely some terminology differences and differences in because it's always interesting when I do something. I'm like, okay, is this going to turn out to be a slot type that Google has defined? And so I go roaming through the @sys dot
Right.
whatever's and try to find something. If not, then I define it as any, and then I list my values or in some cases I have to say, okay, I'm going to define my type myself, even though Alexa's got one, so that it's available for both.
And that actually reminds me. So does Alexa have the notion of a regex type where you can define patterns? So that's interesting.
Nope.
Dialogflow only got that one relatively recently, but Action Builder started out with one.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah, no.
It's one that I know that Microsoft's bot builder or Lewis, or I think they're one and the same, had for a very long time.
Yeah. No, I haven't ever used that. That is interesting.
Me neither. I saw a presentation.
Okay, so this conversation all started when I was talking about what I would really need. Well, one, I would like the built-in slot values, entity types, samples, phrases, or words to be listed so that we have an idea of what's
Right.
there. That was kind of my first soapbox item. My next soapbox item was this list of, I'm doing this and I'm doing it fairly well as far as language model goes, but there is a limitation on what I understand, and my mental model like ends at some point, and I don't feel like I am a master of language models in the least, and that there are some mysteries and things that aren't even really talked about, because it comes back to I feel like the words that I choose, the number of words that I choose, the number of samples that I give in for any slot type affects how effective it is. And in some cases, I could be overdoing it and making it more closed, or I could not be providing enough samples. I don't even know what enough samples is. Is it 3? Is it 20? Is it 1,000? I don't know what
and it's interesting to me because when I read your post on that, my reaction was, why? That was when it made me go, I feel like I'm missing something here, because I wouldn't even begin to think about that as an issue on the Dialogflow or Google side. Now, I'd think about that in terms of intents and making sure my phrases I've got enough phrases for intents, but
Yes.
not for entities. And I think part of the reason why is because I can choose whether to make it closed or open.
Right.
And
And
not worry about it.
And you can choose to make it in bounds or out of bounds by setting an intent context.
Right.
Everything is live for me. Everything's global.
Right.
So there are collisions galore depending on what you do.
So, okay, so hang on. This might be my mental model again, suddenly shifting. So if I have an intent and I've specified a bunch of phrases, and I have specified particular slots in there that have this color type, there's a chance that it will go match a completely different intent for that slot, or a completely different type for that slot. If I've also matched fruit, for example, and omitted the one and we will pretend for the moment that orange is neither a color nor a fruit, just for the moment.
So if you've got two different slot, or in your case entities, but if I have two different slot types, that one's lists colors and one lists fruit, and I use those in sentences, probably not. But there is a case where if one of my samples for my utterance, in an utterance for my intent is just the slot value, so I want to be able to ask, like, what's your favorite color, and be able to say blue. Orange. Or what's your favorite fruit, and you say
apple. Yeah.
Blueberry. No, I don't know. I'm just joking. So in order to get that slot only answer, then I'm opening myself up to, because the lists aren't closed, right? So now I've got two things that in essence accept one word strings, or I guess one or two word strings, right? Basically. Yeah. And so if I were to then ask something and I answer something that's not in either list, there's going to be a collision. Amazon's going to need to pick something to be the slot type that it decides it's going to resolve to. So if I say pizza, then is it going to say that the slot type was a fruit, or is it going to say that the slot type was a color?
And this is the crucial difference. And that was, I think, what I was not getting, was that you have that it is open, because on the Google side, that will resolve to a no match. The intent won't match, it resolves to a no match intent.
Yeah. So that is something that's that is lacking. So everything is live, and everything is is open ended.
That I think is the crucial difference between the two that
Yeah.
I didn't have my head wrapped around.
Yeah. So no, that would be if I could say, I want this intent to only be active during this, context, because we could with state, then you can say, okay, I'm in this state and I'm asking for a color. Um, and if you say a color, then you get a color, and if you say something else that's not, then it matches to unhandled, and then you can say, oh, ask the question again, or something like that. But in the end, if under the covers you have two different slot types that are really one or two word strings that are I don't know, simple words, then you don't know which one it's going to map to. And so in some
Interesting.
cases you have to include both if you want to handle a slot only response.
Very interesting. Okay. And I find that even more interesting looking at what Google did with Action Builder. Remember I said Action Builder, it gets more confusing that we've got parameters and slots and
Mm-hmm.
there's some overlap. In Action Builder, you can say that a scene has slots to fill in the scene. And you can say that a scene has intents.
Yeah.
And the intents can have parameters. So what it seems to do is if you say something, it will try to fit it into one of the slots. If it doesn't fit into one of the slots, it then tries to fit it into one of the intents.
Okay.
If it fits into one of the intents, then you do whatever the intent said, which could be to transition to another scene, which may or may not fill in the slots in that scene with the values of the parameters that just came from the intent.
Okay.
If that made sense to you, you're several steps ahead of me because I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. And so I'm not even sure that what I said was entirely correct.
Okay. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah. So when people say, "Oh, you don't need," Alexa doesn't need intent context. You can just define states. I'm like, no. You obviously are not doing skills that are as involved or complex as what I've encountered, because almost every skill I encounter some situation where sometimes there's collisions, and if there's a collision and it resolves it one way, you cannot just assume that it's always going to resolve it that one way.
Because the language model can be changed.
Yeah, so the language model can be changed. Like you could add values to the language model, or if it's an extension to something that that Amazon provides, then they could change it, or how they rank things, or some algorithm behind the scenes or something, and then you don't really know. If it's as simple like I'm asking 5 different yes/no questions, and in this context it's yes/no for this, or okay, states, yeah, that works. That's easy peasy, right?
Some places it makes sense, but
in some other cases, especially, and it really gets it to the point where if you want to be able to have the user answer with like a 1 or 2 word answer without some sort of carrier phrase in front of it or behind it, which is just part of normal conversations, then you get into this area where it's problematic.
okay. All very interesting.
Which so then says, okay, so if I don't have control over what is in and out of context, or if the list is opened or closed, then the thing that I can configure is the number of words and what words I use, and the number of samples to influence one way or another.
So now your question makes sense to me. And because that really was a totally foreign concept to me.
So, well, and it's good to know, because I'm just like, okay, now besides just wanting intent context, I want to be able to specify if my slot types are open or closed.
Closed, yeah.
Thanks, Amazon.
Okay, everyone. So that was our past selves talking about it. We hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah. So just let us know how things are going with what you're doing with language models and your questions about it, and success stories. We'd love to learn about what you're doing as well.
And until next time, we're Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Take care, everybody.
Take care.